Hey there, this lecture is going to be a quick one. It's covering Cabrera Cabrera Chapter 9, Scaling Systems Thinking. Some of the things that are going to lead this quick talk. What stages constitute bottom-up scaling of systems thinking? Next one, which I might argue could be some of the most important ones, is where should I focus my effort, or I guess your effort, when scaling systems thinking? How does scaling and democratization relate with one another? And then how can top-down control ultimately doom a system? So it's a short chapter in the book, so hopefully it's a short discussion here. Okay, so first off, Cabrera and Cabrera get into this idea of bottom-up influence of change. And so ironically, we've talked a lot about how reductionism, this idea of trying to isolate elements of a system into individual parts, is often problematic. Ironically, they kind of allude to this. They don't explicitly say reductionism, but this idea that if you are going to essentially get to kind of macro state, complex adaptive organizations, things that are organizations, entities, problem solving, or whatever, kind of like the development of the SDGs, that in order to actually get to that point of complex adaptive organizations, you really actually need to boil down much more so to a readily accessible state of systems thinking. And so if you look at here, the first thing that we usually start off is making sure that you have clear information available and that there are simple rules in place. And simple rules, this is just clear, understandable guidelines, principles. They could be laws or so forth, that everyone agrees to at least, or at least is willing and knowingly able to abide by, and that the access of information of what is needed to be understood is readily available. And then you kind of start to bump that up a bit. Access to adequate instruction and practice. So, education, the ability to get involved. This is where this idea of starting to get to more democratization of ideas, that it's not just continuously being spoon-fed or force-fed from someone else, that people have the elective ability to get involved in different things. And then once you kind of get to this idea where people and entities are able to live and practice in the relationships, you get to this idea of lifelong systems thinker. And so this serves as individual scale. These two are supposed to be over yonders. So everything below the line is individual scale. Once you have established the individual robust systems thinker, then we get to groups of systems thinkers. So now you start to coalesce folks together, and then they start to coalesce around an issue or a cause. Not necessarily having like-minded individuals, but passionate people who can at least organize well around a central idea or issue or theme or so forth. You probably already have done this in various capacities. And once you start to have groups of systems thinkers who are able to identify, because not all people are going to be able to identify all traps and relationships and entities and components to be wary of, but that's why you start to bring people together. It's one thing that's made our species so successful. And then you can get to that idea of being more organizationally capacitated, knowing limitations, strengths, community organizations, knowing how to work cross sectors, that sort of thing, and be adaptive, to be fluid. And so the best organizations, nonprofit, for-profit, municipal, so forth, they are very savvy when it comes to that ability to have relationship-based work in a community. And so the thing that we want to focus on here, and this is one of the things I really think is important, is this idea of circles of influence and concern. And so in the book, they give you essentially two circles that you can look at. There is the proactive focus and the reactive focus, and inside both of those circles, you have the circle of influence and circle of concern. And so it's pretty straightforward. You are essentially the center circle, and one way of calling it is called locus of control, or circle of influence. Basically, what do you actually have influence over? What are you actually able to manipulate, to change, to course, to influence, basically? So what Cabrera and Cabrera, they don't actually make up this concept. This is kind of a well-known concept, that in order to have like a proactive approach, as in you're moving and shaking, you're doing good stuff, your circle of influence gets bigger and bigger and bigger the more local and focused that you are. So even if you are, say, the circle of concern is timely gun rights or climate change or eradicating food deserts. Like, those are enormous, enormous issues. And then if most people just get hung up on the enormity, they actually don't end up doing much because this circle of influence gets small. And so that's what happens over here, is this reactive focus. People get really riled up and maybe shout out a big old word storm on Facebook or something like that. But actually the large circle of concern is overwhelming, and people don't do enough proactive work within their local communities, within local partnerships and so forth. So this is really the whole think globally, act locally. And that you as an individual, amongst billions of individuals, your greatest impact to actually affect the circle of concern is how much you actually practice within the circle of influence. It is this proactive versus reactive focus. So in the book, they say something along the lines of scaling, which actually means democratization. And so a lot of times when a business or a government or whatever, if they've come across something good that works at a smaller or local scale, or a local singular entity of success, they'll want to try and blow that up. So that's why when you got something good, you oftentimes don't want to keep it to yourself, because you want it to expand and either have a collective good or to make a profit. When the founding fathers essentially established the United States, they wanted to expand upon the idea of liberties and freedoms to all of the new citizens of this new country. Manufacturers will want to do this where they can find that ideal price point for production. In the book, they use the Ford company, Henry Ford, saying, okay, if we can identify the perfect price point for each one of these new automobiles, we'll get these to the masses, all the while still generating profit so that we can keep creating to then keep selling. What is that sweet spot, secret sauce, ability to scale and have accessibility to replicate that single local success? And so they really, Cabrera and Cabrera super argue the idea of democratization, that systems thinking needs to be of, for, and by the people, and that the practice of systems thinking inherently requires the power of that intellectual capacity to be in the hands of many, not few. And so this is why, for instance, the coalesce of powers in political parties can be problematic when you only have this dichotomy, this just two-party system, and many people arguing for the dissemination of power across many parties. So I have this note here that CAS, or complex adaptive systems, they thrive where independent actors in any system are able to make their own choices, yet they're following shared rules. And that's not rules that are imposed upon them, such as like a monarchy or that sort of thing, but really shared rules as in, okay, we are decided these are the rules, we're going to create them, and we're going to all agree to abide by them. Sports, does this thing where athletes are essentially independent actors, but there's predictability to how they're going to behave, and that helps other agents and other actors to behave accordingly. Same thing with traffic, that every automobile is an independent actor, but there are rules and structures to make behavior predictable. It is the idea of predictability, but shared responsibility that makes this idea of complex adaptive systems healthy and resilient over time with that predictability of behavior. Whereas if it's constantly forced fed and there's any change in that, that can cause chaos and eventually the downfall of a particular system. And so this one of the interesting things in the book is they get kind of military pretty quick. And so how do we explain democratization within systems thinking? So it's this idea of, I mentioned monarchy or so forth, this idea of top-down control, that if you are trying to essentially understand a system, such as this causal loop diagram here, if you're trying to map a system, understand a system, to then impose control upon the system, that's going to essentially lead to failure. And not only is it going to lead to failure of those who are trying to impose control, but it's also going to lead to failure, or at least some sort of disturbance to the system itself by imposing that control. So basically that top-down control disregards the allowing and reading of complex adaptive systems just to play out. Like, let a system do its thing, and then as opposed to fighting it and wanting to impose control on it, you like kind of learn the minutia to work within a moving system. And so the example here, and this is the same one that's in the book, General H.R. McMaster, which ironically is back in the news with Trump. I believe he just recently left. Just immediately dated this video, so that's awesome. They actually went ahead, this is 2010, wanted to create essentially a causal loop diagram of the Afghan war. And the original intent was to, let's make this, understand it, and literally it was a quote, if you understand the war, you win the war. And so they went about this, and it just caused most people sheer chaos and confusion of like, what is this? What are we supposed to do with this? How do you actually understand this to then do something about it? So it really got to the idea of like, okay, this helps us read it, but it also just shows there is nothing you can actually do to impose a whole top-down control to change and manipulate and quote unquote win this war. For instance, as you know, it's still very much going on. So they start to wrap the chapter in this idea of a VUCA world, the volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, which, of course, for sustainability solutions and why sometimes they're hard to take off is because they're very much this. That's why we focus on more of this idea of resiliency. How much can we foster resiliency? They start to get this idea of a shift in that military approach, and that this idea of clear communication, this is a quote, clear communication is like sharpening a pencil. You slowly remove the unnecessary until you're left with a pointed, useful message. And so they started to move to this idea of, and this has also gotten some criticism, so I'm not advocating for this, but something that was well embraced in the military post that causal loop diagram is clear, hold, build. So in a sense, like if you are a series of soldiers entering into a besieged area and you're trying to clear out potential militants, this idea of you clear the dangers, once you've cleared them, you hold the house, secure it, and then once you have secured the house, you kind of start to do that over and over again. So you start to build relationships. Okay, is the house next door clear? Okay, is the houses along this whole block, are they clear? Yes, okay, let's start building relationships. And then we start to kind of like do this thing over into neighborhoods, to towns, to regions, and eventually the whole state. So as opposed to this whole enormous top-down approach, we start very singular, that locus of control, circle of influence, and you kind of grow that over time. So it's very intentional, it's repetitive. Again, it's the idea of repetitive behavior, not repeating, but like recreation of that behavior. So that's more or less it, and how you can actually have that idea of scaling systems thinking. You start small, locus control, and you start to build this repeatable behavior over time. It is that makes it predictable. It makes other agents or other actors who are maybe outside of a system see what's going on and they can adapt in. It's easy. So this idea of scaling systems thinking is dependent upon individuals who can systems think, building those relationships. Relationships is always key. And then to systems organize, and that there is an intentional design behind that process that allows for systems-driven organizations to then form. Being proactive in the small spaces where you have control yields those largest gains, and trying to understand systems whole to impose control rather than the flow of systems often leads to failures to the system and to those who often are trying to control it. So here's my challenge to you. For the discussion, I would like for you to identify something that you're interested in. It can be sustainability related or not. I'm starting to see some who are getting away from sustainability, and I actually really like that. And that systems thinking, sustainability doesn't own systems thinking at all. So if it's a different pressing political issue or something just mundane in your life, whatever, it could be anything. And just looking for more of the conceptual understanding. So identify something you're really interested in, and then do those circles of influence and concern. So both of them. So the questions from that is how easy is it for the circle of concern to stay large, like getting really caught up in large issues but not actually doing anything about it? And then from whatever issue you do choose, what can you do to keep more of a proactive focus on control, to then grow that circle of influence? And that's it. All right, thanks.